Our second speaker of the day is Dr. James Hannam. He's going to follow on very nicely from the previous talk and give us some examples of myths, of conflicts between science and religion. James's first degree was in physics in Oxford, and then he did a PhD in history, philosophy of science here in Cambridge. He's written a book. He's asked me to plug. There was a copy on the bookstore, but it's already gone. There will be more coming later. His book, Gods, Philosophers, How the Medieval World Laid the Foundations of Modern Science, is highly recommended. I think without any further ado, James has actually, what is doing his various degrees, is also earning his wage as an accountant, and is privileged every now and then to come back to us to be able to talk to us about some of the history and philosophy of science. It's a great privilege to have him here on the Faraday summer courses. So without any further ado, James is going to talk to us on the mythical conflict, how science and religion got on over the centuries.
Thank you very much, Keith, and it is very exciting to be here once again at the Faraday Institute, and fantastic to see so many of you coming to this course. Most people, as Mark mentioned earlier, most people assume that the history of science and religion is basically a history of conflict. Just looking around Heifers yesterday, I noticed A.C. Grayling's latest book, The Age of Genius, which very much suggests that the 17th century was the time when the shackles of superstition and religion were thrown off and defeated by the sword of reason. Also, Stephen Weinberg's book, To Explain the World, is another popular history of science which very much does suggest that the story of science is the story of beating back reactionary forces of religion and faith. But is this true? I think we should take a look back at the history. Now, as Mark mentioned, in the English-speaking world, the conflict thesis very much owes its origin to the works of two 19th century writers, neither of whom, in fact, were historians, John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White. Draper was a chemist by trade, and his book is actually quite a short work. It's also, as Mark was far too polite to say, absolutely dreadful, and I simply can't recommend not reading it enough. On the other hand, Andrew Dickson White's book, The History of Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, is 2 fat volumes, lots and lots of footnotes, actually quite a good read. And it was that book, I think, rather than Draper's, which lent the conflict thesis its academic respectability and meant that it really did carry the field in history of science right the way up until around about the 1960s, 1970s. But in fact, both of these writers were using the conflict thesis to make particular political and professional points. And this is something we're going to see over and over again. We're going to see that conflicts between science and religion can very often be proxies for conflicts about different things entirely. For example, White was one of the founders of Cornell University in New York, and he was determined that his new university would have absolute intellectual freedom, and one of the things he wanted to do was to make sure that the tradition of always having some clergymen on the board was not to be upheld. He wanted to kick all the clergymen out of Cornell. And his difficulties in actually doing that was one of the things which inspired him to write his book on the warfare of science with theology in Christendom. And today, of course, the new atheists continue to use the conflict myth as a weapon in their struggle to show that science is essentially the only way to understand the world. The conflict myth helps them show that religion is out of date, that it's been debunked, and that science has won every struggle along the way. Well, that's the use of the conflict thesis. It really does have one massive disadvantage from the historian's point of view, and that is that almost all the evidence which is advanced in favour of it turns out either to be completely untrue or at least to be a serious misrepresentation of the facts. And I've listed here a few of my favourite myths of conflicts between science and religion, all of which I have heard used by people who I suppose really ought to know better, who shouldn't actually be continuing to put these mythical events about. I'm not going to name names here, but I certainly have come across some quite distinguished authors using these myths. I suppose the most famous of all is the idea that people in the Middle Ages, egged on by the Christian Church, thought that the earth is flat. We often hear that Columbus was the man who proved that the earth was a sphere, but in fact he did nothing of the sort. Western civilization had been pretty much aware of the sphericity of the earth for the previous 2,000 odd years. And it was, I think, probably Francis Bacon, the Lord Chancellor of England at the beginning of the 17th century and the great promoter of empirical science, who first suggested that people in the Middle Ages thought that the earth is flat. And he was doing it because as a Protestant, he wanted to paint the Catholic Church as backward looking. And so he suggested that the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages was such a stick in the mud, they hadn't even figured out that the earth is a globe. And that was later picked up by other authors, most notoriously the American Washington Irving, who in his 19th century biography of Christopher Columbus, quite a heavily fictionalized biography, shows the church insisting that Columbus should not set sail across the Atlantic in case he sailed off the edge of the world. In fact, Columbus knew perfectly well the earth was a sphere, so did all his crewmen. They were, however, very concerned that if they sailed west, they might end up in the vastness of the ocean and all die of thirst and hunger. One of my favourite pieces of evidence that people in the Middle Ages knew perfectly well that the earth is a sphere is what happened when a king was crowned. They were handed certain pieces of regalia which were symbolic of their power. There was a sceptre and there was also an orb. And the orb represented the earth. It represented the secular power of the king over the earth, as opposed to over heavenly things. I have to say that if people in the Middle Ages had thought that the earth was flat, they presumably would have presented their monarchs with dinner plates instead of orbs. Another myth is the idea, something that Andrew Dixon White spends a very long time talking about, the idea that the church tried to ban lightning rods. And this was a classic case of White, I think, misinterpreting the evidence. It is true that there was initial reluctance in the 18th century to erect lightning rods on churches and other tall buildings. But the reason for that is that lightning rods work by actually attracting the lightning to strike the building. It's then, of course, harmlessly dissipated into the ground. But if you didn't know that, and you hadn't seen them working perfectly well for many years, you might actually be quite reluctant to put a lightning rod on top of your church and deliberately persuade the lightning to strike there. There's the famous ban on zero that the church was supposed to have promulgated during the Middle Ages. As Keith mentioned, I'm an accountant, I'm actually a tax specialist, and I always like to get a bit of tax into my talks. In this case, the reason that we hear about the ban of zero actually has to do with medieval taxation. When Arabic numerals were first brought over into the West, there was no agreement as to which numeral was to refer to which number. In fact, even today in the Middle East, they use different numerals to the numerals that we use in the West. Our figure for zero actually means 5 if you're in Lebanon or Syria. The fact that nobody knew which number was which meant that it was extremely important people did not use them on their tax returns. And in fact, that was banned in Florence and perhaps a number of other cities during the 13th century. And it seems to be from there that we get the legend that the church tried to ban Arabic numerals and tried to ban zero. My favourite legend, I suppose, is that Pope Callistus V tried to excommunicate Halley's Comet. Seriously believed for a very long time on a basis of a misunderstanding of a historical chronicle. You would imagine that the Pope would have had better things to do with his time. And this is a prime example of the way that once you believe that there is a great conflict between science and religion, you will believe pretty much anything that reinforces that idea, no matter how silly it is. There's also, often we hear that the church tried to ban human dissection. Leonardo da Vinci is often mentioned in this respect. In fact, what is most surprising about the medieval church is that it did not try to ban human dissection, unlike pretty much every other culture that had existed up until that time. There was no human dissection in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, or in the Islamic world. But for some reason, as we'll come to a bit later, in the 13th century, autopsies began in Italy, and soon human dissection was being used for educational purposes. And surprisingly enough, the church didn't really object at all. And finally, there's this consistent idea that there are certain martyrs for science. So Christianity, of course, has its martyrs, and science obviously felt a bit missing out. It was missing out a bit and wanted some martyrs of its own. Now, there's no doubt that the Catholic Church, and indeed, unfortunately, even some Protestants, did burn heretics at the stake many times, a despicable thing to do. But nobody was ever burnt for their scientific beliefs, or anything that really looks like science, as far as we're concerned. The two figures who are most commonly mentioned in this respect are Michael Servetus, who was burned in Geneva in 1553 under the orders of John Calvin, and he was burnt for his Unitarian beliefs, his denial of the Trinity. It is true that in one of his books he mentioned the importance of the pulmonary artery, but that wasn't something, in fact, that was noticed for some time after his death, and certainly had nothing to do with the reason that he was executed. And also in Rome in 1600, Giordano Bruno was notoriously burnt at the stake by the Inquisition. Bruno was one of the early supporters of Copernicus, one of the earliest people to believe that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around. And it's often suggested that this had something to do with his death. But there is a basic chronological problem with that thesis. Bruno was executed in 1600, and the Catholic Church didn't get round to banning heliocentrism until 1616. And not even the Catholic Church will ban you for something it hasn't yet decided is a crime. Mark ran through a number of the ways that the relationship between science and religion has been characterized by scholars over the years. My attempt to boil it down into a neat aphorism is creative tension. I think that there is conflict between science and religion at times, and sometimes that does explode into real disputes. But most of the time, we have to accept that actually the two rub along quite well. They have an interesting dialogue, and they have a mutually fruitful dialogue. Besides, a great many of the pioneering men of science have been unusually religious, not just religious in the sense that everyone was religious in those days, but actually unusually religious, very devout, even by the standards of their day. And I'll come to some of these pioneers a little bit later, but it's worth mentioning that someone like Johann Kepler actually breaks into spontaneous prayer in his scientific manuscripts. And today, there are obviously still a large number of religious scientists. Just in Cambridge, we have John Polkinghorne and Simon Conway Morris. So I think that instead of there being a conflict through history, there has been this creative tension. Religion provides alternative perspectives, an inspiration for scientists to work at studying nature, and also, I think very importantly, a metaphysical justification for science, as we'll come to in a bit. So what I'd like to do is just go on a very quick whistle-stop tour over the next half an hour of 5 periods of history which are generally felt to be key in understanding the relationship between science and religion when the idea of conflict has been particularly prevalent. And starting off in ancient Greece. Now, Greek religion, we were talking earlier about the difficulty of defining religion, and that becomes very difficult when you look at Greece. People are always asking, well, did the Greeks really believe in their gods? And it certainly was true that Greek religion was a great deal more about what you did, what your practices were, your religious practices, whether you were sacrificing at the right ways, than it was about the details of the theology that they were supposed to believe. Greek science, on the other hand, I think was possibly not all it's cracked up to be. We do tend to understand that science was somehow invented in ancient Greece, but when we start to look at what the ancient Greeks, or many of them, actually thought about the way that the world works, we find not only that they were wrong, which of course is completely forgivable, but they were often wrong in ways that seem to us quite difficult to understand. Aristotle, the greatest of Greek natural philosophers, made a whole series of mistakes which really did mean that his idea of the way that the world worked just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to us. For example, he said that heavy objects will have to fall faster than light objects, even though, in fact, it takes about 10 seconds with a teaspoon and a dessert spoon to show that that isn't true. He believed in the spontaneous generation of life, of insects, for example, on rotted food. Again, that's something you can experimentally disprove very quickly. He thought a vacuum was impossible. He thought that for an object to move, it has to be being moved by something else. And that meant he had terrible trouble trying to understand how it was that when you throw something, it keeps going after it's left your hand. Now, those sorts of mistakes don't tell us that Aristotle was ignorant or stupid. They tell us that when he was trying to do science, natural philosophy, he was doing something very, very different to what we understand by it. In particular, I think that the key to understanding Greek science is to realize that it was always intended as a support for a particular religious, philosophical, or ethical system, what Mark earlier called a worldview. Aristotle's natural philosophy is not really intended to explain the world in a vacuum, if you like, not least because Aristotle thought a vacuum was impossible. It's because he wanted to provide a justification for the way that he thought that we should live a good life, and he wanted to show that the world is actually built in a way that suggests that his philosophy has to be true. And when we look more closely at Greek science, we find that they're all at it, and each Greek philosophy, the Epicureans and the Stoics, the Neoplatonists, they all have their own natural philosophy, their own picture of the world. That means, in fact, there are an awful lot of Greek sciences, and you can't simply talk about it in the singular. So during the classical period, the relationship, I think, between science and religion was that science was very much intended to support religious and ethical views, and that was really the only thing that it was for. It wasn't intended to provide a disinterested picture of the world. There is an exception, I suppose, to the Greeks' scientific discoveries not lasting the test of time, and that is their mathematics, the geometry of Euclid, and the splendid mathematical systems we see in Ptolemy. His astronomy was wrong, but his mathematics was fantastic. And in fact, what the Greeks did when they realized just how good their maths was is they brought that into their religious beliefs as well. And you see Pythagoreans and Platonists and Neoplatonists using mathematics as a kind of religious dogma, a way of meditating and understanding the world, a way of understanding the deity. And that means that the Greek science, which was most dominant at the time of the rise of Christianity, doesn't look very much like science to us at all. The dominant Greek philosophy at the time was Neoplatonism, and that was a very mystical and spiritual philosophy. So their natural philosophy was also something that strikes us as being quite a mystical doctrine. They talked about things like the macrocosm and the microcosm, the great chain of being. Now to them, that was no more or less scientific than Aristotle. But to us, we do very much get the impression that the kind of Greek natural philosophy which was dominant at the time of the rise of Christianity wasn't the sort of thing that we recognize as being particularly scientific. And that means that when Christianity came along, it didn't, in fact, attempt to wipe out Greek science, as we sometimes hear. It instead actually was quite happy to take elements of Greek science from all the different philosophies that we've seen and put them together into its own natural philosophy, which, like all the others, was intended pretty much to buttress their metaphysical and religious assumptions. Now, getting back to the conflict myth, there are one or two stories about late antiquity which you will often hear mentioned by popular historians. For example, this idea that the Christians burnt down the great library of Alexandria. And funnily enough, that was invented by an 18th century historian who I'm sure you all heard of, Edward Gibbon. The great library of Alexandria may or may not have existed in the form that we understand it. It's fairly mythical in itself, but if it did exist, it was long gone by the time Christians came to control Alexandria. It is true that the female philosopher Hypatia was murdered in 415. That's often held up as an example of Christian bigotry, but Hypatia was the victim of a political rather than a religious dispute. She sided with the prefect of the city of Alexandria, who was a Christian, against the bishop, who, funnily enough, was a Christian as well. This was a dispute about power rather than about philosophy. In 529 AD, Justinian, who we can see here, closed the schools in Athens. These were Neoplatonic schools, and he closed them because he perceived that they were attacking Christianity. That was undoubtedly a case of the Christian emperor trying to close down pagan institutions. But it's quite difficult to get from that to the idea that it was what we would understand as science that he was trying to attack. In particular, the ban didn't affect Alexandria, and shortly afterwards we find the most significant scientific figure of late antiquity, John Philoponus, working in Alexandria, and he was, in fact, a Christian, one of the first important Christian figures in science. I could talk about him quite a lot, but there's one thing I think really does mark him out. He is the first person in history who says, and this is 1,000 years after Aristotle had written, that actually heavy objects and light objects don't fall at the same speed. Heavy objects do not fall faster than light objects. Just try it yourself and you'll see. Which I think is quite remarkable that it took 1,000 years for someone to point that out. It's often said, I think, that the reason we have any kind of access to Greek science is it was all preserved in the Arabic by Islamic writers. But in fact, although a lot of it was preserved that way, most of it has also been preserved in the Byzantine Empire in its original Greek. In fact, if you look at the surviving Greek corpus in the manuscript tradition, you actually find that there is an overbearing preponderance of maths, science, and particularly medicine. Christians, if anything, were more likely to copy Greek science than they were to copy other kinds of Greek literature, such as history or poetry. So leaving the ancient world behind, we come to my own personal favourite period, the Middle Ages. And of course, the Middle Ages have really traditionally been thought of as an age of faith and superstition. But I'm with the great historian of medieval philosophy, Edward Grant, because he calls it an age of reason. Because this was the time when we really see logic and philosophy being harnessed to advance theology. And that was taking place in universities. And universities that were founded from the 12th century onwards were a brand new kind of institution. They simply hadn't existed in the world before. And what was unique about them, and indeed still is that they were independent, self-governing corporations. And that independence meant that they were able to face the world with a united front, and they became adept at playing the church off against the state in order to continually increase their privileges. The first universities were Bologna, Oxford, and Paris. And the University of Cambridge, of course, over 800 years old, and it was founded around about 1209. The story is told that an Oxford student murdered his mistress, and the townsfolk got so irate about this that they went and strung up all his housemates. And not surprisingly, Oxford students and masters decided that Oxford had got a little bit too hairy for them, and they came to a rather nondescript place in the bogs of East Anglia, and they decided they would set up shop there. Here, as it turned out. For some reason, the murder of the mistress didn't figure particularly prominently in the universities, Cambridge University's 800th anniversary celebrations a few years ago. And while they were at university, students were actually getting a basic grounding in mathematics and in science. The syllabus included arithmetic, and that was both how to do sums, which was called algorithmus after the Arabic-derived textbook that was used, and also number theory, which came from the Neoplatonistic idea that there was something divine about numbers, and by understanding the way numbers work, you could train your mind to rise to higher things. They also were taught basic astronomy using a textbook by an Englishman called John Sacrobosco, geometry, trying to get their heads around Euclid, and also natural philosophy, based, of course, primarily on the works of Aristotle. And you really had to have studied all of these, at least to some degree, before you were given the opportunity to go and study theology, which really was the thing that was, as Mark said earlier, the queen of the sciences, the top faculty, the place where you really had to go if you wanted to make your mark. And okay, the syllabus in science and maths at the medieval universities was a little bit basic as far as we would understand it. But what's remarkable about it is it meant that there were tens of thousands of people in medieval Europe who were getting a basic education in maths and science, and there'd never been anything like that in the world before. And with so many people who had that basic grounding, it was almost inevitable that there would be those who would become fascinated by it, to develop it further, and that would help with science progressing. Another essential point, and again this is something that Mark briefly covered, was the way that during the Middle Ages the metaphysical foundations of modern science were, I think, laid down. And you've got to remember that science before the modern period really had no practical applications at all. We did talk earlier about the way that it was used to undergird ethical and religious assumptions. But really you needed to have a reason like that to study science, and Christianity very much provided one. So I think that Christianity in this respect did provide an essential element for the rise of modern science. And we see important philosophical thinking at the school of Chartres in France during the 12th century. William of Conches, who's often credited with coming up with the distinction between primary and secondary causes. I don't think he actually did come up with it, but his name always crops up. The primary cause for a Christian is God. God is ultimately responsible for absolutely everything. But God uses secondary causes, and secondary causes are the causes in nature. And it is the function of natural philosophy to understand those causes. And you're not getting in God's way by trying to understand those causes, because you always have in mind that the primary cause of God is something separate. And William's colleagues at the School of Chart also explained that the reason that nature is intelligible is because it has a rational and loving creator, the God that they knew through the Bible. And of course the Bible told them that God had created the heavens and earth. Furthermore, it's often been said to me, at least, that the reason that Christians can't do proper science is that we believe in miracles. We believe that God can intervene. Well, Jean Buridan, during the 14th century, the rector of the University of Paris, presented one of the clearest explanations of how a Christian can hold the idea of miracles in his mind while still being a good scientist. As Buridan said, that it simply didn't matter if God occasionally intervened, because we will be able to recognize that as being contrary to the ordinary course of nature. Indeed, there's very little point of having a miracle if you can't recognize it as such. But it's perfectly fine for natural philosophers to study that ordinary course of nature, and the fact that a miracle is occasionally possible doesn't detract from that. And finally, my last bullet, as people in the Middle Ages realized that nature can be understood through the language of mathematics. And this was best expressed, I think, by an Oxford mathematician, a man called Thomas Bradwardine, at the beginning of the 14th century. Bradwardine, as well as being a mathematician, later became Archbishop of Canterbury, which does very much show that having a good scientific career wasn't necessarily going to getting in the way of advancing in the church. And although it has often been said that maths was the thing that had to be used to describe nature, up until Bradwardine, you simply don't see it happening. It's a commonplace in, for example, the works of Roger Bacon. But what Bradwardine did is he created a mathematical formula to describe how Aristotle, who was his model, believed that an object should move. So he was the first person to actually produce a mathematical formula which encapsulated a theory. So in summary, I think in the Middle Ages, medieval Christians said to themselves, well, nature is worth studying because God created it, and that means it's also an act of Christian piety to study nature because you are studying God's work. And medieval science, I think, went beyond those rather abstract concepts with a number of really quite impressive scientific achievements. Buridan used the concept of relative motion, which we're all familiar with from a train. Where the train is moving, we're not sure whether it's us or the train next door moving. He used boats, obviously, didn't know about trains. And he was able to express the idea of relative motion in a way that his student Nicolas Rem then used to explain why, if the Earth is moving, we can't feel it, which was an argument that was later used by Copernicus. Buridan also developed impetus theory, which he may have borrowed from John Philoponus, perhaps via Arabic sources. Impetus theory explains why an object will continue moving after something has stopped moving it. It's very similar, if not identical, to Newton's first law. And Buridan used it to explain why the planets move. He said that God started the planets off moving at the beginning of time, and because there's no friction in the heavens, the planets continue to move with nothing to stop them until doomsday. And that was completely opposite of what Aristotle said that he said that the planets needed something to continuously move them or they would stop. We've mentioned dissection, which arrived in Italy in the 13th, 14th century. And there are also great technological advances in the Middle Ages. Agricultural productivity, mechanical clocks, probably developed in East Anglia, spectacles in northern Italy, And medieval Europe was also fantastically open to foreign ideas. For example, the compass and gunpowder and printing all came from the East, but they were adopted and improved in the West with, of course, the consequences that Columbus was able to sail across the ocean. We were able to print hundreds of thousands of books, and we became fantastically good at killing each other. And finally, the mean speed theorem, which is my favorite medieval advance. That's another mathematical theory developed by the Merton calculators in the early 14th century. It describes how a object moves when it's being uniformly accelerated. And that, as we now know, actually describes how something moves when you drop it to fall under gravity, to a fairly close approximation. And Nicolas Rem, Buridan's student, actually used geometry to prove the mean speed theorem. Thus, he was able to show that the area under a graph could be associated with the distance it moved, that the gradient of a graph could be associated with acceleration, ideas which were generally thought to have originated with Descartes around about 300 years later, but we can now trace those ideas from Rem all the way to the work of Galileo. So moving to the scientific revolution, another prevalent conflict myth is that Copernicus was afraid of persecution and thus didn't publish his famous book, De Revolutionibus, saying that the earth goes around the sun, until he was on his deathbed. In fact, it was a cardinal who eventually persuaded him to publish, and he dedicated his book to the Pope. He's not, in fact, the only book of astronomy that was dedicated to that particular Pope, Paul III, and I think we can be confident that he didn't read any of them. In fact, Copernicus did delay publication, but what he was concerned about was the criticism he was receiving from his fellow mathematicians and philosophers. Because he'd sent earlier drafts of his work around which were being discussed and problems with it had been identified, and he had adapted his theories by the time he actually came to publish them. Nonetheless, before 1600 there were probably less than 10 convinced Copernicans in the world. It simply wasn't really a terribly controversial subject. Everybody thought he was wrong. And it wasn't until the work of Kepler in the 17th century that heliocentrism really became widely believed, largely because Kepler used his theory of elliptical orbits to create mathematical astronomical tables which were so astoundingly accurate compared to anything that had gone before that it just became accepted that the theory that they were based on probably had to be true. But one of the early Copernicans was this man, Galileo. And in 1616, after the death of Giordano Bruno and 60-odd years after the publication of Copernicus's book, heliocentrism was being used by some theologians as an example of how you might read the Bible in a non-figurative way. And the church was worried about this because it was in the throes of the Counter-Reformation. So heliocentrism was banned by the Catholic Church. Now, Galileo had been an early proponent, but he was specifically told by the Pope's enforcer, Robert Bellarmine, that he hadn't done anything wrong, but he had to keep his trap shut from now on. And Galileo correctly realized that the church was making a big mistake here. Not just that it happened to be wrong about heliocentrism, but that it was making decisions about what was right and wrong in natural philosophy, which was outside its own sphere of authority. So Galileo wanted to help the church accept that it had made a mistake, and he used his friendship with the Pope Urban VIII to try and push his agenda within the church. And Urban VIII seemed to be quite open to this, and said that Galileo didn't have to keep his trap shut. He could write a book where he compared Copernicus' theory to the ancient Greek theory of Ptolemy, the two chief world systems. And when he wrote his book, the Inquisition censor actually passed it because he thought that the Pope had said it was okay. But when the Pope read it, he said it definitely wasn't okay. And the reason for that appears to be that one of the characters in the dialogue in Galileo's book was expressing arguments that the Pope had given to Galileo in a way that showed that Galileo was ridiculing them. And one thing you did not do in Italy in the 17th century was ridicule the Pope, and the Pope immediately demanded that the book was banned and Galileo was put on trial. A deeply embarrassing situation for the Inquisition, who'd actually passed the book for publication in the first place. And at Galileo's trial, he had no choice but to admit that he had broken the ban on speaking about heliocentrism, although, contrary to popular belief, he wasn't tortured or threatened with torture. But he was, however, placed under house arrest for the rest of his life, where, ironically, he did produce his most important book on the two new sciences, although that had to be published in Holland due to the controversy and the difficulty in getting anything by him published in Italy. Did Galileo's trial hold back science? Well, I think inevitably there must have been an effect at the time, and we know, for instance, that René Descartes pulled his book Le Monde, which also gave a heliocentric picture of the world, and it wasn't published until after he died. But finding in the long term practical instances of the way that Galileo's trial actually did hold back science proves to be really quite difficult. The Jesuits in particular became adept at ignoring the ban, or rather paying lip service to the ban, but not actually allowing it to prevent them from carrying on the work that they wished to. And, my fourth period to briefly look at is the Enlightenment. And I said that the English-speaking world got to know the conflict thesis from the work of Draper and White, but I think the conflict thesis actually begins in Enlightenment France. The works of Newton came over to France, where they caused a lot of excitement, and they were translated by Voltaire's lover, Madame Châtelet, translated into French. It's kind of ironic, in fact, that around the same time, a chap called Francesco Algarotti published something called Newtonianism for Ladies, with all the difficult bits taken out, but it seemed that the only person who was clever enough to translate Newton's text into French was actually a woman. And of course, many of the Enlightenment thinkers were deists. Some of them are outright atheists, like Denis Diderot and John D'Alembert. But it was one of those cases, I think, in the 18th century, where the people making all the noise were not the people who were actually doing the work. The philosophers became very famous, and they banged off all their books trying to spread the idea of enlightenment. But at the same time, as we'll see, the people who were actually advancing science during the 18th century were, generally speaking, extremely religious, if perhaps rather unorthodox Christians. But just to give one example, the Jesuits, who I mentioned just now, were extremely active during this time. They produced 6,000 scientific papers, allegedly between 1600 and 1773, when, for political reasons, the order was suppressed. And that was back in the day where we didn't have vast numbers of scientific journals that desperately needed to be filled. Well, meanwhile, the Enlightenment philosophers were inventing the myth of conflict. And the reason they did it, I think, was that the Catholic Church, of course, was in a very close alliance with the ancient regime French monarchy. And if you wanted to produce social reform, you really were trying to attack the status quo, trying to attack the monarchy, and trying to attack the church. But that was an extremely dangerous thing to do for obvious reasons. And one of the reasons that they produced this idea of there being a conflict between science and religion, and inventing these stories about how the church had held back science in the Middle Ages, was it provided an indirect and perhaps rather safer way to attack the church, to show that it was reactionary, to show it was a stick in the mud, even though they couldn't attack the present-day church or the monarchy directly. Voltaire comes up with this wonderful quote, really disparaging medieval philosophy and giving it a bad name right up until the end of the 20th century, when finally I think medieval philosophy began to get the due that it deserves. And the encyclopedia, the foundation volume of the Enlightenment, some call it, the preliminary discourse, the preface, if you like, produced by Jean d'Alembert, had a potted history of the history of science as a conflict between Christianity and reason, which was extraordinarily influential. Meanwhile, the scientists themselves, the people who are actually advancing science, are Isaac Newton. One of the Cambridge professors here at the History of Science Department described Newton as the most religious man of the 17th century among some very, very stiff competition. Admittedly, he was an Arian. He rejected the divinity of Christ, and it was interesting just how much effort was made to cover for him by the university and by the authorities to make sure that didn't get in the way of his career. Joseph Priestley, who, if you're English, was the man who discovered oxygen, wasn't quite so lucky. He was a dissenting minister. Eventually, his radical politics caused a riot, and he had to flee to the US at the end of the 18th century. And his great rival, Antoine Lavoisier, who discovered oxygen, if you're French, was having a much worse time. In France, he was guillotined during the French Revolutionary Terror in 1794, 8th of May in Paris. And I mentioned that just because that is one of the cruel ironies of history. The only great scientist ever to be actually executed was killed not by the church or religious people, but by the fiercely anti-Christian Jacobins during the French Revolution. And finally, Michael Faraday, of whom this institute is, of course, named, who did so much valuable work in electromagnetism, and he was an extremely devout member of the Sandemanian sect in London. That's the reason that he was never knighted. He wouldn't accept any kind of honours, although even today he's often referred to as Sir Michael Faraday. And to my last little case study, evolution, Darwinism, that's the classic conflict for a lot of people. It's something we're still looking at the moment. It's interesting to note that the idea that the Earth might be very old and wasn't invented in 4004 BC, as a very literalistic reading of the Bible might tell you, had been around for quite a long time before Darwin. There were also evolutionary theories, such as that of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a Frenchman who suggested in 1801 that evolution might take place through the acquisition of characteristics which your parents had developed during their lifetimes. So I think the idea was, the classic example is that if a giraffe is trying to reach higher leaves, it will stretch its neck. Its children will therefore have longer necks, and they'll try to do the same thing, and you eventually end up with a giraffe with a very long neck. And that was a popular theory because it actually gave creatures almost control of evolution, because they could sort of choose what they wanted to strive for. Unfortunately, it falls down by the fact that one-legged people don't tend to give birth to one-legged children. And Erasmus Darwin was somebody else. He was Darwin's grandfather. He was somebody else who was presenting an evolutionary view of nature. And he produced this poem called The Temple of Nature, which presented a way of understanding how life had developed. It was also one of the last examples of the genre of scientific poetry, now sadly an extinct genre. I can't be the only person who thinks that Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time would have been far better had it been presented in rhyming couplets. And Robert Chambers, he was a journalist from Edinburgh, brought out anonymously his Vestiges of Creation, which was a massive success commercially as well as controversially when it was released in 1844. So by the time Darwin comes along, the intellectual West is reasonably well primed, if you like. And what The Origin of Species did was it didn't just suggest that animals evolved. It produced a mechanism for that, random mutation and natural selection, of course. And although it was controversial, it wasn't banned. It never even appeared on the papal index, something, in fact, which pretty much anything worth reading in the 19th century was on. Was perhaps not as controversial as we might think, because Darwin didn't, in Origin, really talk about the evolution of man. And that was what was really very controversial. People were quite happy to accept that dormice and dragonflies had evolved. They were very uncomfortable with the idea that human beings had evolved from apes. And the famous trial of John Scopes in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, was not, in fact, about evolution per se. It was specifically about whether or not you could teach that human beings had evolved from apes. That trial, of course, has become legendary, thanks very much to the excellent play Inherit the Wind, and it saw two titanic figures, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow, squaring up in what was one of the most celebrated legal cases of the 20th century. Perhaps no less theatrical and no less shrouded in legend is the great debate on evolution between this man, Thomas Henry Huxley, and the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, that took place very shortly after Origin had been published. Huxley had given Origin a glowing review in the Westminster Review, a magazine in which he has this classic piece of conflict mythology that extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science, a strangled snakes besides that of Hercules. I just love the way that people are expected to be familiar with Greek myth at the time. But the great debate that took place didn't seem to have been quite exciting, as legend tells us. Wilberforce, in fact, was one of those people who had been relatively positive about Origin when it came out, and where he was, like everybody else, was having a problem was with the idea of the evolution of human beings. So it was in that context that he asked Huxley, allegedly, whether Huxley would rather have an ape on his mother's or father's side, and Huxley replied that he'd rather be claimed kindred to an ape than a man like the bishop. But Huxley himself had his own agenda. He was a man of humble background who made his way through science. He was one of the first professional scientists, someone who actually owed his living to being a scientist rather than being an enthusiastic amateur. He didn't like the way that the Royal Society in London was stuffed full of clergymen who were essentially treating science as something of a hobby. He didn't think that it was something that could just be a hobby. It had to be something that was professionalized. And he made it his aim in life to try and separate the Church of England from the scientific establishment, something which, to be honest, he pretty much succeeded in doing. But funnily enough, Huxley himself was much less of an evolutionary extremist than you might imagine, and he was never actually comfortable himself with Darwin's theory of natural selection, and particularly what it might say about ethics. He didn't like the idea that natural selection didn't give us any sort of control in the direction that we're moving. So my takeaway points for today, I think that the conflict thesis as traditionally expressed has been completely discredited by historians now, but it is still very popular outside the academy. In its place we have John Hedley Brooks' complexity, or perhaps creative tension. But I think when we do look at historical events which show science and religion interacting, we very often need to dig underneath the headlines and find out if the dispute, if the argument really is about a scientific theory being pitched against a religious dogma, or is it really about people with their own agendas proxies for wider disputes, people who are trying to advance their own cause and perhaps, like the new atheists, are using a conflict between science and religion as the way to do it. So thank you.
Thank you, James, for a fascinating, entertaining tour de force over history. We've allowed plenty of time for questions in this. Lunch isn't until 12:30, so we've got a lot of time. Who would like to kick off? And Julia's there with a microphone. Here we are. Robert.
I'd be keen to hear your take on the origin of the word science, which you used quite a bit over these various phases, long predating Whewell. And my very naive understanding was that we didn't start saying scientist until, 1836 or so.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I was being a little bit lazy, mixing and matching the word scientist and science and natural philosophy. In my book, I don't use the word scientist until the epilogue, when I mention that it was invented in Oxford at a meeting of the British Society for the Advancement of Science, and didn't actually become common currency for decades after that. I've sort of become a bit philosophical about this because of the difficulties that, as Mark showed, of defining science and indeed defining religion, but particularly science. Because people tend to know it when they see it, as a High Court judge once said of pornography, I think it's just a term that we have to become comfortable using. I've also used the term enlightenment, although that's another prime example of a label we've given something which may be rather misleading. So I think it is inevitable that we just use the term science. I'll often preface it with ancient science, modern science, medieval science, to try and get closer to what I'm talking about. But yes, you're right, I was a little bit lazy in the way that I was bandying the term around.
Could I add on that? Do you think a difference between Greeks and at least 19th century naturalists was this idea of monotheism? And first of all, would you agree with that? And second of all, do you think being a monotheist has something to do with the capacity to be a scientist?
I'll bring you back just a few moments for the sake of the cameras.
I'm sorry. Sorry. Good. I think that the difference between Greek science and 19th century science is perhaps not as great as it might seem, but I do think that right up until the 19th century, and I don't think that modern science existed before the 19th century, science continued to be primarily about providing an undergirding for religious, philosophical worldviews. It was very much as David Limburg used to call it, the handmaid to theology, or whatever it was that happened to be your worldview. It was only in the 19th century that we see science becoming a thing in itself, and becoming something that doesn't actually need any kind of support. But that's not to say that even today, science has become something with no agenda. As you all know, science continues to have an agenda. There continue to be things that you can't say, even if they may or may not have scientific validity. I mean, in science, in fundamental science, in scientific research, being wrong a lot comes with the territory. But because there are things, particularly in genetics, where being wrong is actually quite dangerous, I think that research doesn't sort of happen in that area as much as it could, and then we would be able to sort of get it right, if you see what I mean. In particular, the idea that things like political, religious beliefs, intelligence are very much things that we inherit rather than things that we acquire from the environment and the way that we're brought up. It is something which is, I think, very controversial still, and something which can still get shouted down. I don't think that you need to be a monotheist to be a scientist. I do think that when we're asking the question, why did modern science arise in Western Europe where it did and nowhere else, I think monotheism, I think Christianity has to be a big part of that answer. I can't see how you can explain science in a way that some David Wootens, I think, put it all down to Columbus discovering a new world. You get other people who just put it all down to economics. I don't think you can do that. There may have been a lot of factors, but I think Christianity was absolutely essential.
Another question. Just behind. Thank you.
Maybe I shouldn't say this, but it's my understanding that Lamarck has made it back into the conversation with epigenetics and complexity theory.
Sorry, can I?
So it's a question about Lamarck and epigenetics coming back into the whole agenda, the discussion.
I think what I'd have to say, which I hope doesn't sound overly critical, but I think that epigenetics is probably more significant as a sort of a cultural thing than it is than a scientific thing. Epigenetics is completely compatible with mainstream neo-Darwinism, and I think that efforts which have been made to use it as a way to sort of roll back some of the less comfortable conclusions of neo-Darwinism are perhaps not as successful as they might be. So I don't think Lamarck is making a comeback necessarily in that respect, although I do appreciate that that's something that some people have been suggesting.
John down the front here.
Yeah, just thinking of the modern world and things like climate change. Now, John Houghton, for instance, a very distinguished scientist, has made an enormous contribution to study of climate change. But equally well, you have in the United States evangelical Christians who are bitterly opposed to any concept of climate change and so on. You know, there are enormous conflicts there, I think. And I think you've seen the same sort of thing in other fields as well, that in some areas Christians make an enormous contribution, in other areas, like very convinced Christians actually oppose what's being done. How do you do all this? You know, looking at the world we live in.
I think the question of disputes about climate change, disputes about, to mention a couple more, chimeras, embryo research, sometimes that is a straightforward philosophical dispute, and embryo research, I think, is a fairly straightforward dispute between sort of a utilitarian view of ethics and a more human-centered view of ethics. Climate change, I suspect that the disputes are much more political than they are scientific. I think that's a case of where you need to dig underneath and find out what it is that people's real agendas are. Because it's clear that simply laying out facts on one side or another doesn't seem to convince anybody on either side. So it's a different sort of dispute, perhaps, than being a straightforward conflict.
Yes, but if we don't accept the facts as being laid out, how do we make any progress?
Oh, well, I think that you need to accept that, as some person once said, that science advances funeral by funeral. And there have been many cases of particular people hanging on to beliefs long after we would think they should have let go of them. The idea that there's a wonderful story that Richard Dawkins likes to tell about how a lecturer went and shook the hands of the guy. As far as I can tell, that's complete fiction. But it's a lovely story of how science ought to work. But it doesn't really.
Hilary down the front here.
Thanks, James. I'm really intrigued by this fact that the ancient Greeks got a lot of the sort of science, natural philosophy wrong, but their mathematics was so accurate. And I don't. Is there a reason for that? Can we explain that? Is there a difference in method, or what was going on there?
I think the reason for that, and I agree, it's a very interesting question. I think the reason for that is that it's a lot easier in maths to prove you're right. It's very difficult sometimes in natural philosophy to prove you're right. But also in natural philosophy, people took a very long time to get over the idea that you had to actually prove something you already thought was true. And Aristotle thought that his ideas were true, so there was very little point in going out and making all the effort to prove himself wrong. I mean, who wants to do that? But I think fundamentally it is that the rigor of mathematics compared to the rigor of science, and the fact that most experiments are really very difficult, and you have to do them over and over again, and all sorts of sort of human influences come in on that to prevent you from being completely objective. That's much more difficult it's much easier to avoid all of that in maths, because once you've sat down and gone through the first 3 books of Euclid, it's something you're going to believe is true. And because you can then lay down a substrate, making the progress, as you say, of things that everyone agrees on, you can start building. But the Greeks never got to that stage with their science, their natural philosophy. They never agreed on anything. They had all these different sciences, all of which were intended to support different philosophical systems. So they were never in a position to start building on top of that and actually progressing, which is why we see Aristotle still being quoted 1,000 years later by authors like Philoponus and Simplicius.
Is there a trend back that way in current science, with increases in theoretical and computational studies that aren't necessarily based on observation and don't lead to observation?
I think that's possible. I mean, I'm a strings theory skeptic, for instance. String theory is something which in case you don't know, is a theory of fundamental physics that seeks to unite the forces. It's sort of one step towards a theory of everything, but it's all extremely mathematical and very, very difficult to prove experimentally. And that means that if you're going to be fundamentalist about it, it doesn't necessarily qualify as what we all sort of understand physics is supposed to be.
Laurie, a question?
Mike Cumming.
Yep.
Sorry, a comment is that the Greeks didn't trust the physical world. They thought it was a deception. And that's the essence of Platonism, right? And is that's, you know, the obvious way of thinking of this is the cave, right? So you have to go beyond the confines of the physical world, of your embodied self, of the data of the physical world, because it's a deception. And that's the essence of Greek philosophy. And that has a grip on philosophy and theology for centuries before people begin to think that the physical world is real and can give you actual data. And that's still a problem, right? That's one of the interesting things about neuroscience, is this realization that maybe there was something to this Greek idea. Maybe you can be easily deceived. Maybe the science, maybe this, again, it's an empirical question. Can you prove anything if the physical world then can be made to appear to prove it? See what I'm saying? So that's one of the reasons why the Greeks were very good at things like math, because they were Platonic concepts. But it didn't hold up because there was an anxiety around whether physicality could be trusted at all.
Sorry.
So it's a comment of the physical world,
That's when Christianity runs into
and more comfortable with a philosophical rather than actually in the physical world that you see.
Well, that's one of the major strands of Greek philosophy, the Platonists who considered true reality to be just an inadequate copy. But I think with always have to keep in mind that even though for us it means Plato and Aristotle, of ancient Greek history, they weren't necessarily the dominant philosophies, and there were lots had their own natural philosophy undergirding them. So why Neoplatonism, which was dominant in sort of the 3rd and 4th centuries, have this strictly dualistic idea of how the world was.
You've given us plenty of examples from history of where the apparent conflict has been a proxy for something else that was going on. What's the, if you like, give a few more examples of current instances this day. What's the proxy that's behind some of the conflicts, for instance, of Dawkins, the New Atheists, etc.? What's their political agenda?
I think I mean I don't necessarily like imputing motivations to sort of people alive today, although I'm more than happy to do it to historical characters. But I do think that the new atheist agenda is I think essentially the project of Enlightenment liberalism. And it's not necessarily a project that I, for one, have a huge problem with, Enlightenment liberalism. But I think that they do find, I think, the more human-centered way of looking at the world that comes out of, I think, the Christian tradition to be problematic, and it's kind of been changed now because of human rights, which started off as an expression of that sort of human-centered ethics, has now been secularized pretty much completely. So I think that's what the neo-atheists are doing. They're sort of trying to extend the Enlightenment. I think that the ideists, the intellectual design proponents, are also fundamentally political. And I think they represent a particular strand of American conservatism, which is to a great deal the opposite of what the neo-atheists stand for, which is why they take such joy in attacking each other. Intelligent design is actually getting more and more interesting because as it sort of fades from view in the US, it's been growing massively in the Islamic world, and you could almost say that it's now become the dominant evolutionary theory in quite a lot of the Islamic world. And again, it's a sort of a proxy, I think, for a political dispute between people who think that the Islamic world should keep itself separate and different from the West. They are in favor of ID, and people who think that the Islamic world will get on and progress fastest if it tries to westernize as much as it possibly can, and they are the people who are the opponents of the people in the Islamic world who are supporters of ID.
One.
You mentioned that science as a term, as a thing, really arose in the 19th century, about the same time that the conflict thesis arose. And what I suppose I've often wondered, are the two inextricably linked, in that no matter how much historians say that the conflict hypothesis is, misleading and oversimplistic, is it the case that actually they will always go together in the popular consciousness?
Well, I think I've just been reading a book by Peter Harrison who makes the point that both science and religion are 19th century concepts, and given they were only invented in the 19th century, they couldn't very well have had a conflict before then. And I think that the simple historical fact that during the 19th century, science became something which was a subject in its own right. It was a way to make a living. It started to have a fantastic amount of influence on the way that we live our lives. That success meant that it started to gain an authority and stature that it had really never had before. All of those things simply the fact it was getting bigger and bigger in the public space meant that it was going to bump up against religion, which was currently occupying quite a lot of that public space. And so, to some extent, that was always going to be a conflict because both sides were now jostling for public approval, public consciousness. So I do see, I think there's a lot to be said for that idea. But I kind of would like to think that we've got beyond that now because science doesn't need to justify itself in a way that it did in the 19th century. We all appreciate it, we all know what it can do, and in a way the new atheists seem to be continuing a fight that if it's simply about giving science a respect as its due was won 150 years ago.
Two last questions. Firstly, Dennis, and then Andrew, and then I think it will be time for lunch.
Okay.
Thanks. 1844, Vestiges of Creation, Chambers. So nobody liked it, no academic liked it. Darwin hated it, Huxley hated it, they all criticised it. I've never read it actually, but what was it really that they really disliked about this book? Which after all did introduce the idea of evolution, didn't it, into Victorian society. So why did Darwin hate it? And why did Huxley criticise it and all these people? What really got them going on that? Well,
I suppose the answer to that question is probably read Jim Secord's book, but I think some of it may have been the fact that it was a popular account of a number of things that were bubbling away, and it was written anonymously. I think it was intended to be controversial, but it lacked perhaps the rigor that somebody who was actually trying to understand evolution as a scientific theory would like, while at the same time rubbing up people who were against the whole concept of evolution, and it was also it had a deistic view of life as well. But it was also teleological in the way that it was written, I think. So it suggested that life was advancing towards a certain point, that there was progress in evolution, and that was something that Darwin totally rejected, because for Darwin, natural selection didn't have an end in mind, and random mutation, of course, was completely random. And that has often been the case, and even today, we talk about species getting more advanced, getting more complicated, but actually, as far as nature's concerned, there isn't really a direction of evolution. It's just a process which carries on, and although it can never go backwards in the sense that we might think things becoming less evolved, something which does something in a simpler and easier way would be a more highly evolved creature than something that did it in a complicated way. I don't know if that answers the question at all.
And one final question, I think, Andrew.
If we think about the relationship between science and art, historically, I don't sense there has been so much conflict. So does that help in any way shed light on the conflict between science and religion as a kind of control thought experiment?
I hadn't thought of that. Not sure. I think
Laurie is saying that art doesn't have any power.
Sorry?
Laurie's saying that art doesn't have any power.
Oh, art, I think, has enormous power. But is there a conflict between science and art? What do you mean by
Art has a huge effect on people's sense of well-being. You know, the pleasures of music and aesthetics. So it really does change people's lives in a similar way to how religion does. And so therefore, I'm just wondering why there hasn't been any conflict. I mean, Richard Dawkins wrote his book, Unweaving the Rainbow, to try to demonstrate that he had no problem with art, and we shouldn't try to undermine art through the use of science. But I just wonder if it's ever been considered as a way of trying to understand the conflict with science.
Well, perhaps I mean, art doesn't tend to come with a huge amount of metaphysical baggage. But I take your point. It's quite an interesting question as to why science and art aren't necessarily in conflict. Although, I mean, you have to look at what's happened to art since science has become in the ascendant in the late 19th century, and compare art as it was in 1800 to art as it is today. It's certainly changed a lot. You might well think it hasn't changed for the better. And maybe to some extent, modernism and postmodernism in art are reactions to science. Perhaps there has been a conflict, but it's only gone one way.
I think this may be something for further reflection and conversation and discussion over lunch together. We've had a fascinating session here. James has taken us on a wonderful tour through history. Can you join me in thanking him?
Thank you. Thank you.